The Hartman family had always dreamed of owning a house like the one in Hollow Ridge. It was an old Victorian mansion with gables that stretched toward the sky and stained glass windows that sparkled in the autumn sun. Alan Hartman, an architect, had fallen in love with the building's intricate design, while Jessica saw potential in its large, open spaces. Their two children, Emily and David, were excited about having a yard to play in and rooms big enough to feel like they had their own mini-worlds. It was late October when they moved in, the air crisp with the first signs of winter creeping in. Hollow Ridge itself was a quiet, almost forgotten town, surrounded by thick forests and winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The house sat on the edge of town, its once grand exterior showing signs of age, peeling paint, sagging porch beams, and cracked window frames. Yet, despite the wear and tear, there was something undeniably enchanting about it. The first few days were spent unpacking and getting to know the space. Alan and Jessica marveled at the ornate woodwork that framed the doors, the high ceilings, and the spacious rooms. However, the house's age came with its own set of challenges. The floors creaked underfoot, and a draft seemed to come from nowhere, slipping through the cracks in the walls. Jessica noticed a faint musty smell, but she attributed it to the house being closed up for so long. One evening, as they were having dinner in the dining room, David mentioned something odd. "Mom, I keep hearing things in the walls," he said, his fork suspended in mid-air. Jessica exchanged a glance with Alan. "What do you mean, honey?" "I don't know. It sounds like scratching. Like something's moving." Alan chuckled, trying to ease the tension. "It's probably just the house settling, David. Old houses like this make all sorts of noises." David shrugged, but his eyes lingered on the walls as if expecting something to happen. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Alan and Jessica sat in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth. Jessica stared into the flames, her mind still on what David had said. "Do you think there could be something in the walls?" she asked quietly. "Like rats or something?" Alan shook his head. "It's possible, but I doubt it. We'll check when we start the insulation. It's just an old house making old house noises." But as the days went on, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The musty smell seemed to grow stronger, especially in the upstairs bedrooms. No matter how much she aired out the rooms, the odor lingered like a shadow. It was a week later when they decided to begin the insulation work. Winter was approaching fast, and the drafty rooms would only get worse. Alan hired a local contractor, Ben, to help with the project. They started in one of the guest bedrooms on the second floor, removing the old plaster and preparing to install new insulation. Ben was the first to notice it. As he tore down a section of the wall, something odd tumbled out onto the floor. At first, it looked like a bundle of rags, but as Ben unfolded the material, his expression changed. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, holding up the object for Alan to see. Alan stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. Wrapped in the dusty cloth was something small and brittle, a decayed animal carcass, its bones yellowed with age. The smell hit him immediately, a mix of rot and dust that made him gag. "Jesus," Alan whispered, covering his nose. "What is that doing in the walls?" Ben shook his head, just as puzzled. "I've seen a lot of weird things in old houses, but this..." As they continued working, more of the strange bundles appeared. Dozens of small animals, birds, rabbits, even a small dog, all wrapped in the same type of cloth and newspaper. Alan carefully unfolded one of the yellowed papers, squinting at the date. 1938, he read aloud. "These have been in here for almost a century." By the time Jessica came upstairs to check on their progress, the room was filled with the sickly stench of decaying animals. She stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is going on?" she demanded, her voice muffled by her hand. Alan gestured to the piles on the floor. We found these, in the walls. Jessica stared in horror. What the? Why would anyone do this? None of them had an answer. The room felt colder, the air thick with the smell of death and decay. Alan could see the unease in Ben's eyes as he packed up his tools for the day, muttering something about coming back in the morning. As they stood in the room, surrounded by the unsettling remains of the past, Alan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Something about the house, about the way the walls had hidden these grisly secrets, felt wrong. And the more they uncovered, the stronger the feeling grew. The next morning, Alan called a local historian, Dr. Mitchell, to see if he could shed any light on what they had found. Dr. Mitchell was an older man, his hair white and thinning, but his eyes were sharp with curiosity when he arrived at the house. Alan led him upstairs to the bedroom, where the carcasses still lay wrapped in their cloths. Dr. Mitchell knelt down, carefully examining the bones. And the old newspapers. After a few minutes, he stood up, dusting off his hands. "This is fascinating," he said. "It looks like these animals were part of some sort of ritual. Have you ever heard of POW wowing?" Jessica frowned. "POW wowing?" Dr. Mitchell nodded. It was a form of folk magic practiced by the Pennsylvania Dutch. It involved using charms, herbs, and sometimes animal sacrifices to heal people or protect homes. These animals, they were probably part of some ritual meant to ward off evil or sickness. Alan felt a chill run down his spine. So, whoever lived here before, they were performing these rituals? "It's likely," Dr. Mitchell said. POW wowing was common in this area in the early 20th century. But I've never seen anything quite like this. The number of animals, it's unusual, even for POW wowing. Jessica shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "What does that mean for us? Should we be worried?" Dr. Mitchell hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. "I don't think there's any danger. These rituals were meant to protect, not harm. But it does raise some interesting questions about the history of this house." The musty smell had become a part of their everyday life. No matter how much Jessica cleaned, scrubbed, or aired out the house, the odor seemed to cling to the very walls. It was worse in the mornings, especially upstairs in the bedrooms, where the air felt heavy and thick. It wasn't long before the family began feeling the effects. Alan was the first to notice the headaches. They started off mild, a dull pressure behind his eyes that came and went. But as the days passed, the headaches intensified, leaving him irritable and short-tempered. Jessica, too, began to feel unwell, nausea, a constant fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to shake. Even the kids complained of strange symptoms. Emily, normally so full of energy, had grown pale and lethargic, while David had developed a persistent cough that rattled in his chest. At first, they brushed it off as the stress of the move and the excitement of settling into a new house. But the symptoms didn't go away. In fact, they only seemed to get worse. One evening, as Jessica lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the house was responsible for their illness. The smell had permeated everything, the sheets, their clothes, even the food in the kitchen. No amount of cleaning seemed to help. It was as if the house itself was sick, and it was spreading to them. The next morning, over breakfast, Jessica brought up her concerns to Alan. "I think we need to do something about the smell," she said, pushing her food around her plate. "It's making us all sick." Alan barely looked up from his coffee. "I'm already working on it. Once we tear down the rest of the walls and finish the insulation, it should get better." Jessica frowned. "You've been saying that for weeks, but the smell is getting worse. And now we're all feeling sick. Have you noticed how pale Emily is? And David's cough?" Alan sighed, setting his mug down with a little more force than necessary. "Jess, I'm doing everything I can. It's an old house. There's bound to be some issues, but we'll get through it. You just need to be patient." Jessica didn't respond. She knew Alan was trying his best, but her gut told her something was very wrong. She couldn't ignore the fact that their symptoms had started after they found the animals in the walls. Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more going on? As the days went on, Alan's focus on the house turned into an obsession. He spent hours researching insulation techniques, tearing down walls, and checking for mold or water damage. Every evening, after work, he'd disappear into some corner of the house, hammer in hand, determined to fix whatever was wrong. But no matter how much he tore down, the smell persisted. Jessica watched as her husband grew more distant, his once calm demeanor now overshadowed by frustration. His obsession with the house was starting to take its toll on their relationship. They argued more frequently, their conversations often ending in silence or angry words left hanging in the air. One night, after another tense dinner, Jessica cornered Alan in the kitchen. "I'm serious, Alan," she said, her voice tight with concern. "This isn't normal. You're tearing this house apart, and it's not helping. We need to get someone in here, an expert, someone who knows what they're doing." Alan's face hardened. "I know what I'm doing, Jess. I'm an architect, remember? I've dealt with old houses before." "Not like this," Jessica shot back. "This isn't just some old house. There's something wrong with it, something that's making us sick. You can't fix this with a hammer and nails." Alan stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, without a word, he turned and left the room, leaving Jessica standing there, her hands trembling with frustration. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the faint sounds of Alan working late into the night, Jessica felt a creeping sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was changing him, that it was changing all of them. And the longer they stayed, the worse it would get. It wasn't just Alan who was affected. Emily and David had started behaving strangely as well. Emily, usually so bright and cheerful, had grown quiet and withdrawn. She spent most of her time in her room, staring out the window or lying on her bed, her eyes distant. David, on the other hand, had become increasingly agitated. He complained of nightmares, though he could never quite explain what they were about. "Something's in the walls," David whispered to Jessica one night as she tucked him into bed. "I can hear it at night. Scratching. Like something's trying to get out." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "It's just the house settling, sweetheart. Old houses make all sorts of noises." David shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No, Mom. It's not the house. It's something else. It's watching us." Jessica's stomach twisted. She kissed him on the forehead, trying to hide her unease. "You're safe, David. I promise. There's nothing in the walls." But later that night, as she lay in bed, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, Jessica couldn't help but feel like her son was right. There was something in the house, something she couldn't see, but that was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Determined to get to the bottom of what was happening, Jessica began researching the history of the house. She spent hours at the local library, poring over old records, newspapers, and town archives. The more she learned, the more unsettled she became. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a family named the Brenners. Over the years, it had passed through several owners, but none had stayed for long. The most troubling part was what she discovered about the house's last owner, a man named Samuel Brenner, who had lived there during the 1930s and 40s, the same period when the animals had been placed in the walls. According to town records, Samuel had been a recluse, rarely leaving the house except for weekly trips to the local market. Neighbors had described him as strange, always muttering to himself and carrying strange items, bundles of herbs, jars of liquid, and, most disturbingly, dead animals. It wasn't long before Jessica found references to powwowing in connection with Samuel. The old folk magic had been popular in rural Pennsylvania, particularly among the Pennsylvania Dutch community. It was said to have healing powers, but it also involved strange rituals, some of which included the use of animals. The more Jessica read, the more convinced she became that whatever Samuel Brenner had been doing in the house had left a mark, one that was now affecting her family. Jessica couldn't keep her findings to herself any longer. She confronted Alan one evening after dinner, laying out everything she had learned about Samuel Brenner and the house's history. Alan listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he shook his head. "This is ridiculous, Jess," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You're letting your imagination get the better of you. Powwowing? Dead animals in the walls? That's just old folklore. It has nothing to do with what's happening now." "But what if it does?" Jessica insisted. "What if there's something in this house that's making us sick? We can't ignore it anymore, Alan." Alan's face hardened. "I'm not leaving. This is our home, and I'm going to fix it. You need to stop letting these stories get to you." Jessica stared at him, a cold pit forming in her stomach. She didn't recognize the man standing in front of her anymore. The house had changed him, just like it was changing all of them. As autumn settled over the town, the Hartman family continued to struggle with the oppressive atmosphere of their home. The once appealing property had transformed into a source of constant dread and confusion. The odor lingered, more potent than ever, like a thick fog that choked the air. It seeped into every corner of the house, clinging to the furniture, the walls, and even the very essence of the family itself. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, the journal she had discovered spread open before her. The faded pages crackled under her fingers as she read the frenzied entries of Samuel Brenner, the house's last owner. The writing was chaotic, filled with scrawls and drawings that suggested a mind unraveling under the weight of unseen burdens. She traced her finger over a drawing of a circle inscribed with strange symbols, the scrawled words, protection, and sacrifice, standing out among the rest. The journal hinted at rituals performed in the house, methods to ward off malevolent spirits, and the idea that the house itself harbored something ancient and dark. "Mom?" Emily's voice pulled Jessica from her thoughts. "Yeah, sweetie," she replied, looking up. "What are you reading?" Jessica hesitated, unsure how to explain the weight of her discovery. "Just some history about the house, honey. Nothing to worry about." Emily nodded but lingered at the doorway, her brow furrowed. "I had another bad dream last night," she admitted quietly. Jessica's heart sank. "About what?" "About the man in the walls. He was angry. He wanted us to leave." The chilling nature of Emily's dreams had become all too familiar to Jessica. "It's just a dream, honey," she reassured, though doubt gnawed at her. "No, Mom. It felt real. I could hear him scratching." Jessica shivered, the memory of David's similar claims echoing in her mind. "We'll talk about it later. How about I make your favorite breakfast?" As Jessica began preparing the pancakes, her mind was elsewhere, drawn back to Samuel's journal. She knew she had to dig deeper into its contents. Perhaps it could reveal a way to understand what was happening to their family, and, if they were lucky, a way to rid themselves of the house's grip. The tension in the Hartman household escalated as the days passed. Alan, more absorbed in his work than ever, seemed to become a mere shadow of his former self. His obsession with the house intensified, and he frequently spent long hours in the attic, hammering and muttering to himself. Jessica worried for him, sensing a dark energy radiating from the very walls that surrounded them. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Jessica found Alan in the attic, surrounded by dust and debris. "Alan," she said softly, stepping closer. "We need to talk. You're pushing yourself too hard." He looked up, his expression weary yet defiant. "I'm almost done with the insulation. Once it's finished, the smell should go away, and we can finally breathe." Jessica sighed, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not what this is about. It's not just the smell, Alan. It's everything. The kids are scared, and I'm scared. This place, it's not right." "Then why don't you just leave?" he snapped, the anger surprising both of them. "What do you mean leave?" she replied, her voice shaking. "This is our home. I don't want to run away." Alan's eyes darkened. "Sometimes it feels like it's you against me, Jess. You don't understand what I'm trying to do. I can fix this. I have to." "By tearing down the house?" Jessica countered, stepping back. "By ignoring what's happening to us." Alan's face fell, a mixture of rage and pain. "I don't have to explain myself to you. This is my project, my work. I won't let you sabotage it." With that, he turned away, his shoulders tense. Jessica felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She was losing him, losing the man she once knew. The next morning, Jessica awoke to David's frantic cries. She rushed to his room, finding him sitting up in bed, sweat-soaked and trembling. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him. "I saw him again, Mom. The man. He was in the closet this time." David's voice trembled with fear. Jessica's heart raced. "What did he look like?" "His eyes were dark, and he had scratches on his face. He told me to get out of the house," David whimpered. Jessica's stomach twisted. "It was just a dream, David. Just a bad dream. You're safe now." But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmares were more than just figments of their imaginations. She knew they were connected to the house and its history. Later that day, Jessica decided to confront Alan once more. She had been doing research, and she felt it was essential for him to understand the weight of their situation. "Alan," she called as he stepped in from the garage, a layer of dust coating his clothes. "We need to talk about the Brenner family and what they did here." "Not now, Jess," he replied, trying to brush past her. "No, we have to talk about this. The journal mentions rituals and sacrifices. The children are having nightmares, and I believe it's connected to the history of this house." Alan stopped and turned to her, his expression hardening. "You're reaching, Jess. You're letting your imagination run wild. We have to focus on fixing this place, not dredging up the past." "But what if the past is affecting us? What if we're in danger?" she pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. "You're being paranoid," he said flatly. "You're scared, and that's understandable, but you need to trust me." As the weeks wore on, Jessica felt increasingly isolated. The house was taking its toll on her family, and despite Alan's relentless work, things were only getting worse. One evening, while the kids were occupied with their homework, Jessica took it upon herself to delve deeper into Samuel Brenner's journal. The more she read, the more convinced she became that they were living in a place that had absorbed dark energies over the years. Samuel's entries revealed a deep-seated paranoia that had festered during his time in the house. His writings spoke of rituals to protect against malevolent spirits, but as the entries progressed, they grew increasingly erratic. "Something is wrong," Jessica whispered to herself, clutching the journal. "Something is terribly wrong." She decided to confront Alan again, determined to make him understand that they couldn't continue living in denial. "Alan," she shouted, finding him in the living room, going through boxes of supplies. "We need to get out of here." I can't take this anymore. Alan's expression hardened. You're going to drive me insane with this nonsense, Jess. You're letting the kids' nightmares and your paranoia dictate our lives. It's not nonsense. This house is affecting us, Jessica cried. Look at the kids. They are terrified. Alan threw down the box he was holding, frustration boiling over. I am trying to fix our home. I need you to support me, not tear me down. His words hit Jessica like a blow. The man she had married, the one who would have supported her through thick and thin, seemed to be slipping away. The house had become a battleground, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. Jessica's desperation grew as she faced the reality of her situation. She could feel the house closing in on her, its oppressive atmosphere bearing down. She decided to take matters into her own hands. The next day, she reached out to a local historian who specialized in the town's folklore. She explained the peculiar occurrences in her home and her concern for her family. After some back and forth, the historian agreed to meet with her. When they met, the historian listened intently as Jessica described the house's history and the journal entries. He leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed with concern. Samuel Brenner was known in these parts, he explained. People believed he dabbled in POW and folk magic. His reclusiveness and obsession with protection rituals drew a lot of attention, most of it negative. What do you mean? Jessica asked, her heart racing. Some say he believed the house was cursed. It's rumored that he attempted to bind spirits to it, believing it would protect him from something sinister. But in doing so, he may have invited more darkness. Darkness? Jessica echoed, chills running down her spine. The historian nodded gravely. There are stories of families being driven mad by the house. It's said that once you invite such spirits in, they become intertwined with the very fabric of the home. You must rid yourself of that energy, or it will consume you. Jessica left the meeting feeling both hopeful and terrified. She had to confront Alan with this information, but she feared his reaction. He had grown more volatile with each passing day, and she worried about what it might trigger. That evening, she found Alan in the garage, his frustration palpable as he worked on a pile of wood. Alan, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. I met with someone today. He knows about the Brenner family and the house. Alan paused, looking up. And what did he say? That you should run away like a coward? No, he said that we need to take action. The house is affected by dark energies, spirits that Samuel Brenner may have invited in. He said we need to cleanse it. Alan scoffed, the tension between them snapping. You think some sage or ritual is going to fix our problems? This isn't some ghost story, Jessica. It's not a ghost story. It's reality. Our children are suffering because of this place. Can't you see that? His expression softened, but his pride held him back. I'm not giving up on this house, Jess. This is our family's legacy. But what kind of legacy? One where our children are afraid to sleep in their own beds. One where we're haunted by the past. Alan's silence was deafening. Jessica could see the conflict in his eyes, the remnants of the man she once knew battling against the shadows that had taken hold of him. I can't do this alone, Alan, she finally admitted, her voice breaking. We need to work together, or this place will destroy us. In the days that followed, Jessica and Alan engaged in a fragile truce. They researched cleansing rituals and spoke to a local spiritual leader who agreed to help them. Together, they prepared for the ceremony, gathering herbs and other items needed to drive out the darkness. On the day of the ritual, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow through the windows. Jessica felt a chill creep over her as they gathered in the living room, their children watching from the stairs, uncertainty etched on their faces. "Remember, we're doing this to protect our family," Jessica said, trying to reassure them. Alan nodded, his determination evident. They lit candles and placed them in a circle on the floor, creating a space that felt both sacred and heavy with expectation. As they began to chant the words the spiritual leader had given them, Jessica felt the air shift. The house creaked and groaned, as if it were alive and resisting their attempts to cleanse it. Suddenly, the candles flickered violently, and a cold draft swept through the room. David clung to Emily, both children wide-eyed with fear. "Stay close to me," Jessica shouted, trying to maintain her composure. Alan's voice grew stronger as they continued the chant, his conviction seeming to push back against the encroaching darkness. As they finished, an intense stillness fell over the house. For a moment, it felt as if the weight pressing down on them had lifted. But then, a loud bang echoed from the attic, shattering the fragile calm. The sound echoed through the house, and the children shrieked, darting toward their parents. Alan exchanged a worried glance with Jessica, the earlier resolve replaced by anxiety. "Stay here," he instructed, moving toward the attic door. "No, Alan. Don't," Jessica cried, but he was already halfway up the stairs. "Mom?" Emily clung to Jessica, her small frame trembling. "It's okay, honey. It's just the house settling," Jessica lied, trying to mask her own fear. Alan reached the attic and pushed the door open, revealing a darkened space littered with boxes and forgotten remnants of the past. As he stepped inside, the air grew thick with an unexplainable heaviness. "What is it?" Jessica called from below, unable to shake the feeling of dread creeping over her. "It's nothing," Alan shouted back, but Jessica could hear the strain in his voice. Moments later, a horrifying scream pierced through the silence, sending a shockwave of terror through Jessica. "Alan," she screamed, rushing up the stairs with the children in tow. When she reached the attic, she found Alan on the floor, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He was staring into the darkness, breathing heavily as if he had seen something unspeakable. "What happened?" Jessica demanded, kneeling beside him. I don't know," he stammered, shaking his head. "I saw something in the corner." "What do you mean?" He pointed a trembling finger into the shadows. "It was watching me. I could feel it. It's here, Jess. It's really here." Jessica felt a chill grip her heart. "We need to leave. Now." "Wait. I need to see," Alan insisted, pushing himself to his feet despite his apparent fear. "No. We have to go." Before she could protest further, Alan took a step toward the darkness, his eyes fixed on something just beyond the shadows. "Alan, don't." But he stepped closer, his demeanor shifting from fear to an almost desperate curiosity. The tension in the room escalated, palpable energy that crackled in the air. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. Panic surged through Jessica as she clutched her children tightly. The darkness seemed to swallow them, the air thick with an oppressive silence. "Stay close," she commanded, her heart racing. "Mom, I'm scared," David whimpered, pressing against her leg. "Me too," Emily added, her voice small and trembling. In the dark, Alan's breathing grew ragged. "I have to see it," he murmured, lost in his obsession. "Alan." "Stop!" Jessica shouted, feeling the grip of fear tightening around her throat. He turned back toward her, his eyes wide, almost wild. "You don't understand. It's been here for so long. I need to know." "Know what?" "That it's real? That it's been tormenting us?" Jessica's voice cracked, desperation rising within her. You're losing yourself in this. Maybe I need to lose myself. Alan yelled, the words echoing off the walls. Maybe it's the only way to understand what's happening to us. With that, he stumbled further into the darkness, leaving Jessica reeling. She felt the walls closing in, suffocating her, and she knew she had to act. Alan, she shouted, forcing her way into the shadows after him. We need to go. But the darkness was overwhelming, and she couldn't see anything ahead. She fumbled her way, her heart pounding as she called out for him, fear coursing through her veins. Suddenly, a flicker of light illuminated the attic, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Alan's figure stood near the far wall, his gaze fixated on something Jessica couldn't see. Alan, she shouted, rushing toward him. What are you doing? He didn't respond, his focus unwavering. In the light, she could see the terror etched across his face, the way his hands trembled. Alan, please, she pleaded, her voice raw. Come back to us. But it was as if he couldn't hear her, lost in a trance that rendered him oblivious to her presence. Finally, Jessica reached him and pulled him back, forcing him to turn away from the shadows. We have to leave. Now. He blinked, confusion washing over him. What happened? You were lost in the dark, Jessica replied, her voice steadier now. We're all scared. We need to go home. As they moved toward the stairs, a strange sound echoed behind them, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the attic, causing both of them to freeze in place. What was that? Alan gasped, his voice trembling. I don't know, but we need to hurry, Jessica urged, clutching the children's hands tightly as they fled down the stairs. The house felt alive around them, every creak and groan amplifying their fear. They rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It's locked, David cried, panic rising in his voice. Help me, Jessica shouted, throwing her shoulder against the door. Alan joined her, and together they forced the door open, stumbling out into the crisp night air. They stood on the porch, breathing heavily as the cool air filled their lungs. Jessica glanced back at the house, her heart pounding. The windows seemed to stare back at them, the darkness inside pulsating with a life of its own. Let's get in the car, she urged, pulling the children along. Alan hesitated, glancing back at the house. What if it follows us? We can't stay here, Jessica insisted, shoving him toward the car. We need to get away from this place. They piled into the car, Jessica fumbling with the keys as her hands shook. The engine roared to life, and she quickly backed out of the driveway, her heart racing as she felt the weight of the house slowly lift off her shoulders. As they drove away, the shadows of the house receded in the rearview mirror, but Jessica knew the terror they had experienced would linger long after they had left. What do we do now? Alan asked, glancing at her, uncertainty flooding his eyes. We need to find a place to stay, Jessica replied, her voice steady despite her fear. Somewhere safe. They drove in silence, the weight of their ordeal settling over them like a heavy blanket. The road ahead seemed endless, but Jessica felt a flicker of hope igniting within her. They were alive, and together they could face whatever lay ahead. The family stayed at a motel that night, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above them. Jessica tried to distract the children with games, but the haunting memories of the house lingered in the back of her mind. Are we ever going back? Emily asked, her small voice filled with concern. Jessica knelt beside her, brushing her hair back gently. No, sweetheart. We're not going back. We're going to find a new home. One that's safe. Alan sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. Jessica could see the shadows of doubt creeping back into his expression. Do you really think we can just leave it all behind? We have to, she said firmly. We can't let that place control us any longer. But what if it's not over? What if it comes after us? Alan's voice was thick with fear. It won't, Jessica insisted, her resolve strengthening. We have each other, and that's all that matters. But deep down, she wondered if they could ever truly escape the darkness that had engulfed them. Days turned into weeks, and as they settled into a new routine, the shadows of their past continued to haunt them. Jessica tried to create a sense of normalcy for the children, but every creak of the floorboards and flicker of the light sent shivers down her spine. Alan grew increasingly withdrawn, consumed by guilt over their decision to leave. What if we could have saved it? He asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. We weren't equipped to handle that darkness, Alan, Jessica replied, trying to soothe him. We did what we had to do. But as the night stretched on, the feeling of being watched returned, more palpable than ever. It was as if the shadows from the house had followed them, clinging to the edges of their new life. One evening, while tucking the children into bed, Jessica noticed a strange symbol carved into the wooden frame of Emily's bed. Her heart raced as she reached out to touch it, the familiar feeling of dread washing over her. Mom, what is it? Emily asked, sensing her mother's unease. It's nothing, sweetheart. Just an old mark, Jessica lied, forcing a smile. But deep down, she knew this was more than just an old mark. It felt like a warning, a reminder that the darkness they had escaped was still very much alive. As the days wore on, Jessica felt the weight of her fears intensifying. The symbol remained, constant reminder of their ordeal. She confided in Alan, urging him to take her seriously. We need to find out what it means, she said one evening. I can't shake this feeling that it's connected to the house. Alan frowned, conflicted. What do you want to do? Go back? No, but we need to understand what we're dealing with, she insisted. Together, they researched local legends and the history of their old home. The more they uncovered, the more chilling their discoveries became. Samuel Brenner's influence stretched beyond the house, entwining itself into the very fabric of their lives. We have to confront this, Jessica said, her determination solidifying. We can't let it control us any longer. Alan nodded reluctantly, his fear evident. But how do we do that? I don't know yet, Jessica admitted. But we'll figure it out. Together. They decided to return to their old neighborhood, the decision heavy on their hearts. As they approached the house, the air grew thick with tension, an invisible barrier that seemed to resist their presence. Are you sure about this? Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica took a deep breath, her resolve unwavering. We need answers. They stepped onto the porch, the familiar creak of the boards echoing their unease. Jessica's heart raced as she reached for the doorknob, memories flooding back, laughter, joy, and the darkness that had seeped into their lives. As the door swung open, they were met with an unsettling silence. The house felt different, emptier, yet somehow more alive. Let's split up, Jessica suggested, her voice steady despite her nerves. We need to cover more ground. Alan nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. Just be careful, he warned. I will, she promised, watching him disappear down the hallway. Alone, Jessica felt the shadows closing in around her. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, drawing her deeper into the darkness. She steeled herself and made her way to the attic, the place where everything had spiraled. Out of control. As Jessica climbed the stairs, the air grew colder, the atmosphere thickening with each step. She reached the attic door and hesitated, recalling Alan's terror and the darkness that had consumed him. Stay strong, she murmured to herself, pushing the door open. The attic lay in disarray, remnants of their life scattered across the floor. But in the corner, she spotted something that sent a chill down her spine, a dark figure, barely discernible in the shadows, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Who are you?" Jessica demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The figure remained silent, its presence a suffocating weight in the room. "I know what you did to my family," she shouted, summoning every ounce of courage. "You won't take us again." As if provoked by her words, the figure lunged forward, the air crackling with energy. Jessica felt an icy grip on her heart, but she stood her ground. "Leave us alone," she cried, the power of her voice shaking the very foundations of the house. The figure hesitated, and in that moment, she reached deep within herself, tapping into the strength of her love for her family. "Your darkness has no power here," she declared, her voice echoing through the attic. With a flash of light, the figure dissipated into the shadows, leaving only silence in its wake. Jessica felt the heaviness lift, the oppressive energy that had surrounded her for so long finally releasing its grip. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. "Alan," she called, rushing down the stairs. He appeared in the hallway, his expression a mixture of concern and hope. "What happened?" "I confronted it." "It's gone," Jessica replied, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Are you sure?" Alan asked, stepping closer. "Yes," she assured him. "We're free." They embraced, their hearts finally unburdened. As they stepped outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the house. It felt like a rebirth, a new beginning for their family. "Let's go home," Jessica whispered, knowing that home was wherever they were together. With renewed hope, they drove away, leaving the past behind. The shadows of their former lives faded into memory, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. In the weeks that followed, Jessica and Alan focused on healing their family. They sought therapy and support, determined to break the cycle of trauma that had plagued them. The children began to thrive, their laughter filling their new home, a sound that had been so scarce in the old house. Jessica and Alan worked together to rebuild their relationship, confronting their fears and learning to trust each other again. Every night, they shared stories with the children, creating new memories that would overshadow the darkness of their past. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Jessica looked at her family and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "We made it through," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Together." Alan smiled, reaching for her hand. "And we'll keep moving forward, no matter what." The children cheered, their joy infectious, and Jessica felt a warmth in her heart that she hadn't experienced in a long time. In that moment, she knew they were stronger than ever, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the seasons changed, Jessica and Alan continued to embrace their new life. They learned that healing was a journey, not a destination, and together they navigated the ups and downs with resilience. The old house became a distant memory, a chapter in their story that had taught them the importance of love and family. In its place, they built a legacy of hope, a testament to their strength and the power of overcoming darkness. And as they watched their children grow, they knew that no matter what challenges life threw their way, they would face them together, united in love and courage. Jessica sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. She felt a sense of peace envelop her, knowing that their story was far from over. With her family by her side, she was ready to embrace the future, no matter what it held. Jessica and Alan parked in front of their old home, a familiar sight stirring a whirlpool of emotions within them. The neighborhood had changed, yet everything felt oddly the same. Memories flooded back, the laughter of their children playing in the yard, family gatherings filled with joy, and dark moments they wished to forget. As they walked toward their house, old neighbors emerged, some with warm smiles, others with furrowed brows. An elderly woman approached them, her voice trembling as she whispered warnings of strange happenings since their departure. "There's a bad energy in that house," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if the darkness were lurking behind her. That night, as they settled into their old home, Jessica was jolted awake by the sound of children's laughter, a sound that quickly morphed into frantic whispers. Alan, half asleep, dismissed her concerns, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Shadows danced along the walls, and a chill swept through the room. The next morning, Jessica wandered through the house, each room whispering secrets of the past. The attic, once a vibrant playroom, now loomed ominously, filled with dust and memories that felt more suffocating than nostalgic. While cleaning, she stumbled upon an old diary, the pages yellowed and fragile. The entries chronicled strange phenomena experienced by the previous owners, a descent into madness punctuated by desperate pleas for help. Jessica's heart raced as she read the final entry, a warning about a malevolent force that had taken hold of the house. Later, Emily and Ryan, their children, expressed their discomfort about their new home. "Mom, there are voices," Emily said, her eyes wide with fear. Ryan nodded, insisting he saw shadows darting in the corners of his room. Jessica's heart sank as the unease deepened. Determined to understand the unsettling energy surrounding them, Jessica and Alan visited the local library. Dusty archives revealed a disturbing history. Their house had seen several families, each plagued by strange occurrences and tragedies that echoed in the past. A local historian met with them, her face etched with concern as she recounted tales of a family that once lived there, their lives shattered by an unresolved tragedy. "The house holds their pain," she said, her voice a soft whisper. Jessica felt the weight of the house's history bearing down on her, shadows creeping into her dreams and blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. One evening, while playing hide-and-seek, Emily and Ryan went missing. Panic surged through Jessica as she and Alan searched the house, finally finding the children huddled in the attic. Their eyes were wide with fear as they recounted seeing a man in the corner, a figure that sent chills down Jessica's spine. The confrontation turned emotional as Jessica voiced her fears to Alan. "What have we done? This isn't safe for our children," she cried, desperation tinging her words. Alan reassured her, but tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to erupt. That night, the house erupted into chaos. Footsteps echoed down the hall, doors creaked ominously, and a palpable dread filled the air. Jessica felt the presence watching them, urging her to take action. In a bid for answers, Jessica contacted a local paranormal investigator, who agreed to examine the house. Equipped with cameras and recording devices, they hoped to capture evidence of the supernatural. As the investigation unfolded, the children exhibited an unsettling awareness of the entity. They drew pictures of the man, each description chilling Jessica further. The investigator recorded strange sounds and flickering shadows, heightening the tension in the house. Then, a child's voice broke through the air, calling for help, sending shivers down their spines. The investigator shared the dark past of their home, built on land soaked in violence and crime. The previous family, too, had been connected to the tragedy that lingered in the walls. Jessica revisited the diary, piecing together connections between their experiences and the family's misfortunes. Her heart raced as she realized how deeply intertwined their lives had become with the house's history. Alan's paranoia intensified, each creak in the floorboards setting him on edge, while Jessica struggled to keep her family grounded amid the chaos. Determined to reclaim their home, Jessica devised a ritual to cleanse the house, hoping to rid it of its dark energy. She enlisted Alan's help, their hands trembling as they prepared for what lay ahead. As the ritual began, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows deepened, thick with anger, and the children sensed the disturbance, their cries piercing the night. The house roared to life, doors slammed, lights flickered, and a visceral dread enveloped them. Jessica and Alan stood firm, their priority clear: protect their children at all costs. In a climactic confrontation, Jessica and Alan faced the entity that haunted their home. They demanded it leave, drawing strength from their love for their children. "You will not take our family," Jessica cried, her voice echoing in the oppressive darkness. The entity responded, revealing its tragic history, a plea for acknowledgement rather than vengeance. In that moment, Jessica understood that compassion was the key to their liberation. She reached out, offering empathy and understanding, allowing the entity to find peace. With the darkness lifted, the family began to heal. They redecorated their home, transforming it into a sanctuary filled with warmth and love. Jessica and Alan sought therapy to address the trauma, and slowly, Emily and Ryan began to flourish once more. As they settled into their new lives, Jessica reflected on their journey. The weight of fear had diminished, replaced by the understanding that facing their past had made them stronger. The house, once a prison, became a symbol of resilience. Hope blossomed within their family as they embraced their newfound beginning. Jessica and Alan worked together to create a safe haven, filled with laughter and love. They connected with their community, forging bonds that soothed old wounds and fostered new friendships. One afternoon, Jessica sat on the porch, watching her children play freely in the yard. A smile crept across her face as she realized they had overcome the darkness together. United as a family, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, their love a shield against the shadows of the past. The aftermath of their ordeal settled like a heavy fog over the Bretsuis household. Jessica and Alan had successfully cleansed their home of the dark presence, but the relief was tinged with anxiety. While their lives had returned to a semblance of normalcy, whispers of the past still lingered in the corners of their minds. The children, Emily and Ryan, had begun to thrive once more, but Jessica felt the weight of an unresolved tension within the family. In the weeks following the ritual, they adopted new routines. Alan focused on renovation projects, while Jessica spent more time outside with the children, creating a safe and joyful environment. Yet, as they engaged in these activities, there were nights when Jessica would hear whispers on the wind, fleeting voices that reminded her of the shadows they had faced. One evening, as Jessica was preparing dinner, she heard the unmistakable sound of children laughing in the attic. Heart racing, she turned to Alan, who had been hammering in the garage. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Alan paused, frowning. "It's probably just the kids playing," he replied. But deep down, Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She approached the attic door, her hand hovering over the knob, a mix of curiosity and dread swirling in her mind. What if the darkness had returned? Determined to face her fears, she opened the door and climbed the stairs. The attic was dimly lit by the setting sun, casting eerie shadows across the walls. She called out, "Emily? Ryan?" Silence enveloped her, amplifying her heartbeat. Perhaps it was just her imagination. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small box tucked away in a corner, covered in dust. She pulled it out, wiping it clean, revealing the name, Martha, scrawled on the top in faded ink. Intrigued, she opened it and found an assortment of old photographs and letters. Each item was a glimpse into the past, revealing a family that once inhabited the house, filled with love and loss. The more Jessica explored the contents of the box, the more unsettled she became. One letter described a desperate plea from Martha, written to a friend, revealing her fear of something sinister lurking in the shadows. "I can hear them at night," it read. "The whispers are getting louder, and I fear they mean to take my children." With each page she turned, the weight of Martha's sorrow seeped into Jessica's bones. She felt an inexplicable connection to the woman, as if their experiences were intertwined through time. That night, unable to shake the feelings of dread, Jessica decided to confront Alan. Sitting across from him at the kitchen table, she shared her findings. "We need to know what happened to Martha," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we understand her story, maybe we can put this to rest for good." Alan sighed, weary from work. "Jessica, we've already been through so much. What if digging deeper only opens old wounds?" But Jessica's determination was unyielding. We owe it to our family to understand what we're dealing with. I can't ignore this. The next day, they returned to the library, diving deeper into the history of their home. Hours passed as they sifted through old records, each discovery revealing more about the tragic family that had once lived there. Martha's family had faced a series of misfortunes, illness, financial struggles, and ultimately, the loss of their home. The historian they had spoken to previously was helpful in piecing together the timeline, revealing how the family had been torn apart by grief and despair. Jessica discovered a newspaper article that reported Martha's disappearance. Martha was never found, she read aloud, her heart pounding. Her children were placed in foster care, and the house was left abandoned, steeped in mystery. Alan's face paled. You're not seriously thinking that there's a connection between what happened to her and our family, you? I don't know, Jessica replied. But we can't ignore the signs. We have to find out if there's something unfinished here. Their search led them to an old neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had lived in the area for decades. With a mix of reluctance and intrigue, she invited them into her home to share what she knew. I remember Martha, she began, her voice trembling. She was a sweet woman, but the last few years, they were dark. She'd talk about shadows in the house, voices at night. I thought she was just stressed, but I didn't realize how serious it was. As Mrs. Henderson spoke, Jessica noticed her hands trembling. One night, I heard her screaming. I rushed over, but when I got there, she was gone. Only her children were left behind. Jessica's heart raced. Did you ever see her again? No, Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes glazed with memory. But the whispers, they never left. I can hear them still, even now. That night, unease filled the air as Jessica lay in bed. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing around her. Help us, the cries felt familiar, tugging at her heartstrings. She rushed to the attic. The memories of the box flooding her mind. There was something she needed to find. As she climbed the stairs, the darkness wrapped around her like a cloak. In the attic, she rummaged through the contents of the box, hoping to uncover more clues. The whispers intensified, filling her with dread. Help us. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the light bulb above her. Panic surged as shadows danced around her. She could feel their presence, desperate, longing, and sorrowful. Get out, she screamed, backing away, but the shadows pressed in, forcing her to confront the truth she had been running from. Desperate for answers, Jessica sought the local medium, who was known for her sensitivity to spirits. The medium entered their home with a sense of foreboding, feeling the lingering energy that had unsettled Jessica for so long. As they gathered in the living room, Jessica recounted her experiences, her voice trembling. The medium nodded, closing her eyes in concentration. There's a heaviness here, a presence that seeks acknowledgement. It's tied to a woman named Martha. She is lost. Jessica felt a pang of sympathy. What happened to her? Why is she here? The medium opened her eyes, a mixture of sadness and determination in her gaze. Martha's spirit is trapped, unable to move on. She needs closure, and it may be tied to her children. Feeling a deep connection to Martha, Jessica and Alan organized a gathering in their home, inviting the children of their community. The plan was to create a safe space for everyone to share stories, filling the void that Martha once had in her life. That evening, laughter and chatter filled the air as children played, their innocence a stark contrast to the heaviness that had once plagued the house. But as the night wore on, Jessica noticed Emily and Ryan lingering by the attic door, their expressions turned serious. "Mom, we saw him again," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "The man from before. He said he needs help." Jessica felt her heart stop. "What did he say?" Sweetheart. He wants us to find something. He wants us to help Martha. Determined to help, Jessica, Alan, Emily, and Ryan ventured into the attic the following day. They brought the box of Martha's belongings with them, hoping that reconnecting with her history might guide them toward closure. As they sifted through the photographs and letters, Emily's eyes fell upon a small, worn-out doll tucked in the corner. "Look," she exclaimed, pulling it out. The doll's dress was faded, but its eyes seemed to glimmer with a longing for connection. Jessica's heart ached at the sight. "This must have belonged to Martha's daughter," she said softly. Just then, the temperature dropped, and a faint whisper echoed in the room. "Thank you, help us." Understanding the gravity of the situation, the family held a small ceremony in the backyard to honor Martha and her children. They placed the doll alongside the photographs and letters, creating a memorial that acknowledged their struggles and pain. As they lit candles and shared their intentions for peace, a sense of calm enveloped them. The air grew still, and for the first time, Jessica felt a flicker of warmth against the chill that had settled in the house. In that moment, the shadows that had lingered in the corners began to recede. Jessica glanced at Emily and Ryan, who held hands tightly, their faces illuminated by the candlelight. "We're here for you, Martha," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "You're not alone anymore." Days turned into weeks, and the house began to transform. The energy shifted, the whispers grew quieter, replaced by the sounds of laughter and warmth. Jessica and Alan focused on creating joyful memories, and the children flourished in their newfound freedom. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jessica stood on the porch, breathing in the crisp air. She felt a weight lift off her shoulders, a sense of clarity that had been absent for so long. The shadows had lifted, and the past no longer held them captive. As she turned to enter the house, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. For a fleeting moment, she saw a woman standing by the edge of the trees, a gentle smile on her face. It was Martha, her spirit finally at peace. Months later, the Bretsuis family continued to thrive. The house was filled with love, light, and laughter. Jessica often thought of Martha, cherishing the connection they had forged. The past was no longer a burden, it was a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. As Jessica watched her children play in the backyard, she realized that they had not just freed a spirit, but had also discovered their strength as a family. The shadows would always be a part of their story, but they had emerged victorious, embracing the light that followed. Their journey had transformed them, turning pain into purpose, and they would carry Martha's memory with them, honoring her legacy in their hearts. In the shadows of the past, they had discovered the power of love, connection, and healing. Jessica knew that the darkness could return, but they would face it together, united by their shared experiences and the light they had created.